I know the exact moment I went wrong. It wasn't in the garden. It wasn't when I kissed his face in the darkness. It wasn't when I took the money. It was before, long before. And for a long time it seemed completely right. I spent 3 years beside the man who fed multitudes, who stopped storms, who gave the dead back to grieving mothers. I saw all of it, with these eyes. And still I made the decision I made. Not because I didn't believe in him, because I believed in a version of him that he had never promised to be. And that mistake, that specific mistake, is what most people still cannot see when they hear my name. My voice has been reconstructed with artificial intelligence, but what you are about to hear really happened. The stories on this channel come from real biblical texts, words that have survived for millennia because they are true. I can still smell the olive trees. It's strange. Of all the things that could have stayed with me, the faces, the words, the weight of the coins in my pocket, what stayed was this, the smell of that night. Old resin, damp October soil, tar torches burning 200 meters away, lighting up helmets I myself had summoned. I stood there, motionless. Across the brook he was kneeling, and I knew that he knew I was coming. He always knew everything. That was exactly what made what I was about to do so absurd, and at the same time, in my mind at that moment, so necessary. You want to call me a traitor, I know. It is the word that stuck to my name like a second skin, and no one can see me without it anymore. Judas, the traitor, as if that night were all I had ever been, as if I had been born from that decision and had not lived anything before it. But I did live, 3 years. And what happened during those 3 years is what no one wants to understand, because understanding makes the story far too complicated. And complicated stories are hard to use on Sundays. So let me tell you, from the beginning, before the garden, before the coins, before the kiss. I was from Kerioth. That does not seem important until you understand what it meant. The others were Galileans, fishermen from the north, men who smelled of fish and spoke with an accent that made Jerusalem's elite wrinkle their noses. Peter was rough and loud. James and John were fishermen's sons with an ambitious mother. Matthew had been a tax collector, and look at the irony of that now. But I was from the south, from Judea. I grew up a day's journey from Jerusalem, and the rhythm of the city, the language of the scribes, the logic of the temple, I knew all of it. I understood how it worked. When the others arrived in the city and stared at the courtyards with their mouths open, I already knew the names of the priests. I already knew the alliances. I already knew who truly held power and who only pretended to. I was not peripheral. I never was. When Jesus chose me, and it was he who chose me, that needs to be clear, I did not run after him. He saw me and said, "Come," and I went. He did not choose just any man. He chose someone who had what the others did not: vision, organization, the ability to look beyond the immediate scene and ask, what comes next? How does this sustain itself? Where will the resources come from? That is why he gave me the money bag. Think about that. 12 men, and he chooses one to keep the money, to manage it, to make the everyday decisions about how much to spend, where to buy, how to distribute. He chose me for that. Not Peter, who was the closest. Not John, who was the most loved. Me. I carried that responsibility as if it were an honor, because it was. The movement was growing. Donations came from wealthy women who had been healed, from entire villages that had been fed. I organized it all. I knew how much there was. I made decisions, and I believed. This needs to be said, because without it, nothing else makes sense. I believed with everything I had. But here is what I never told anyone. I believed in a version of Jesus that Jesus had never promised to be. I did not realize it at the time. No one realizes that kind of thing while they are inside it. You only see it when it is already too late, when the pieces are already scattered on the floor. Then you look back and begin to notice the signs you ignored, the moments when he said one thing and you heard another, the expectations you brought into that relationship from the very first day without ever checking whether he shared them. I came from a land waiting for a king, not a metaphor, a real king, someone who would take up arms, drive out the Romans, and restore what had been lost. When Jesus came, I saw the signs. I was there when he fed 5,000 people with practically nothing. I saw the paralyzed walk. I saw the blind see. Once, on the other side of the sea, I saw him stand in a boat in the middle of a storm and speak a word, just one, and the wind stopped. The wind stopped. And I thought, it is him. And when he reveals himself, it will be impossible to contain him. That was what I was waiting for. The moment when he would release all of that toward real power, toward Rome, toward the corrupted temple, toward what needed to be torn down. I waited for that every morning. And every morning he woke up and went to heal another leper. The crack did not appear all at once. Cracks never appear all at once. It first appeared as a small question, almost imperceptible, on some ordinary day when we had spent the entire afternoon in an unnamed village, tending to an endless line of the sick. I was exhausted and my feet were raw, and I looked at him, who never seemed exhausted in the same way we were, and thought, how long are we going to stay here? I did not say it. I never said it. It was a question I was ashamed to have, so I kept it, and I kept every question that came after it. When he refused to be made king by force, and the people wanted it, I saw the energy in that crowd. It was something that needed only a spark. Instead, he withdrew alone and let all that potential dissolve into the late afternoon like smoke. I kept that. When he said the way was the cross, that the kingdom was not of this world, I kept that. When he spent an entire conversation with a Samaritan woman beside a well, from a people we were not even supposed to speak to, in a place where we were not supposed to be, while time passed, while Rome continued, I kept that. And that is how the bag began. Not the leather bag I carried, the other one, the one we carry inside, where we throw everything we cannot process, the small disappointments, the resentments that seem too small to deserve attention. We push them down and push them down and push them down until the bag is full. And when the bag is full, we begin to make calculations we would not have made before. We begin to find reasonable things that once would have been unthinkable. We begin to build, in silence, an alternative logic. The money I took from the common purse, yes, I took it, I will not lie about that, was not about greed. It was about control. It was the only area where I still felt I was making decisions, a tiny, shameful way of asserting that I existed. And then came that night, the house in Bethany, the dinner, the smell of old candle wax and freshly baked bread and something else, nard, the kind of thing that costs what a worker earns in a year. Mary was there with the jar in her hand, and before anyone could say anything, she broke it, without hesitating, without calculating, without asking permission, and poured it all over his feet. The smell filled the entire room in seconds. I felt something harden inside me, a year's wages. It was my job to know the price of things. And she simply poured it over the feet of a man who could have used that resource to feed whole families. I spoke. This time I spoke, and he answered me with a calm that was not kindness. It was a boundary. He told me she had done the right thing, that it was for his burial, and something inside me that had been held back for a long time came loose. If he was not going to be what I expected, if he was walking toward death instead of toward the throne, if 3 years of movement were about to end on a Roman scaffold, then someone needed to make a decision. I got up from the table. The smell of nard was still everywhere. I left without explaining where I was going. I already knew the address. The walk to the house of the high priest was about 20 minutes. I walked it with a plan that seemed, I need to be honest about this, completely reasonable. That is the detail no one can accept, that there was logic, that I did not go there spiraling in hatred. I walked in a straight line with a clear argument. The argument was this: he was never going to act on his own, but if someone forced the situation, an arrest, a real danger, then the power I had seen would have to manifest. He would be forced to show who he was. I was not handing Jesus over. I was creating the conditions for Jesus to finally reveal himself. That is what the word traitor cannot contain. all the monstrosity and all the pathetic humanity of it at the same time. I had rationalized a betrayal until it looked like service. 30 pieces of silver, the price the law established as compensation for the accidental death of a slave. Not a fortune, a routine indemnity. That should have told me something. But I was inside my plan, and when we are inside our plan, we do not see what is beside it. We see only what confirms it. I accepted. Because in my mind, the amount did not matter. What mattered was what would come after. Days passed. Days I spent sitting at the table with him, as if nothing had been decided. He washed my feet. At the Last Supper, before everything happened, he stood up, tied a towel around his waist, took a basin, and went from one to another. Then he came to me, knelt down, and washed my feet with his hands. I looked at that man kneeling before me and thought I would break inside. I did not break, because the alternative was to dismantle the plan, and the plan could no longer be dismantled, or at least I had convinced myself it could not. There is a point at which you have gone too far to find the way back without having to recognize who you have become along the way. I left soon after. The Garden of Gethsemane at night is a place of heavy silence. The torches I brought with the soldiers tore through that silence in a way that felt wrong. Too much noise, too much clanging metal for a place made for stillness. I knew where he would be. I had always known where he would be, and I saw him, kneeling, his head bowed. He stood up before I came close, turned, looked at me. There was no surprise on his face. There was something worse, recognition. Like someone seeing arrive a thing that had been foretold, and that hurt exactly as much as the prediction had said it would. I approached him, said his name, and kissed him on the face, according to the agreed sign. He looked at me for a second that seemed to have no length, and said, "Friend, do what you came to do. Friend." He called me friend in that moment, not with irony, not with anger, with a sadness I had never heard in a human voice before, and never heard again afterward. The soldiers moved forward, someone drew a sword, there was blood and confusion, and I stood still, waiting for the moment, waiting for him to act. He did not act. He let them bind him. He let them take him away. And within seconds the garden was empty except for me and the twisted olive trees and the sound fading toward the city. I stood there, unable to move. The plan had worked perfectly. Every step had worked, and the result was zero. There was no reaction. There was a bound man being taken to trial, and me alone in the garden with the smell of resin and the sound of torches disappearing in the distance. And then it came, slowly like rising water, the understanding of what I had done. I had not forced God's hand. I had handed an innocent man over to people who would kill him, and he had looked me in the eyes, called me friend, and chosen not to stop me. I spent the night walking without direction. I did not sleep. The October cold entered my bones, and I did not feel it. Something had broken inside me. Not guilt yet, because guilt comes after the shock passes, but something structural, like a beam that had held up the weight of everything I had built, and had now given way, and the collapse was still happening, slow, relentless. By dawn, I already knew what had been decided. I already knew he was going to die. I went to the temple with the 30 coins. I threw them before the priests. I said I had betrayed innocent blood. The oldest priest looked at me with the patience of someone in a hurry. He said that was not their problem. It was mine. I turned and left. I heard the metallic sound of the coins being collected from the floor behind me. That sound. 30 silver coins being gathered from the stone floor on a cold spring morning. That is the sound I carry, not the words, the sound, because in that sound was the definitive answer to what I had been, an instrument, a piece moved from one place to another by hands that had never seen me as a partner. I had believed myself a strategist when I was a pawn. The real cost was not death. The real cost was this. I left that temple convinced there was nowhere to return to, without checking, without trying. I had assumed, the same way I had assumed everything throughout those 3 years. I assumed. That was what I did. I did not ask. I decided. And that time the decision was, the door is closed, without knocking, without waiting to see if there was someone on the other side. The real cost was not staying to see Sunday. Peter denied me 3 times. That same night, outside the house of the high priest, near a fire, 3 times he said he did not know Jesus, the last time with swearing, with the kind of denial that leaves no room for interpretation. Peter had promised only hours before that he would die before denying him. The difference between Peter and me was not the severity of what we did. We both betrayed. We both broke everything. We both reached the bottom on the same night. The difference was that Peter stayed. He stayed close enough to see what would happen in the morning. Not because he was sure he would be received. He stayed without knowing whether the door was still open, betting only that it was worth knocking and finding out. And the door was open 3 times, beside the same sea where he had first been called. He was asked whether he loved him. 3 times he answered yes, 1 for each denial. As if the cost of each fracture could be covered, not erased, covered, with the right answer given at the right moment. I did not stay to discover that. I decided the answer before asking the question. And that is the truth it took me centuries to formulate clearly. You can follow someone faithfully for years and still be following a projection of your own, a version you built, fed, protected, and never verified with the real person. I loved Jesus. That is not an excuse, it is a fact. But I loved a version I had assembled from pieces of what I needed him to be. The warrior Messiah, the strategist king, the power that would finally settle history's accounts. And when he was not that version, I did not ask myself whether my version was wrong. I asked what was wrong with him. That is the mechanism. And it is not exclusive to me. Do you know someone who entered a marriage with a version of the other person in their head and, when the projection met reality, made an irreversible decision to force the other person to become what they had imagined? Do you know someone who came to faith with an unsigned contract in their hand? Healing, provision, protection. And when God did not sign it, declared him in default and walked away? Do you know someone at work who knew exactly how the project should be done, exactly where the leader was wrong, and when they were not heard, made a decision that destroyed years of trust just to prove a point that never needed to be proven that way? You know me. You have been me in some part of your life, or you are being me now. I am not preaching. I have no authority for that. I am only telling you what remains when you look back from where I am and see the pattern with the clarity distance allows. The pattern is this. Loyalty to your own vision became greater than openness to what was actually happening. And when the moment came to choose between the vision and the person, you chose the vision. You called it principle, coherence, integrity. I called it that too. What destroyed me was not that I was wrong. Everyone is wrong. What destroyed me was that I decided, without evidence, without trying, without knocking on the door, that the mistake was irrecoverable. That the mercy I had seen offered to lepers, to prostitutes, to tax collectors, to Samaritans, that mercy was not available to me. I decided that alone, before dawn, with the coins still in my hand. And what I cannot know, what I will never be able to know, is what would have happened if I had stayed. If I had endured the shame of the garden, and the humiliation of the coins, and the weight of the other's gaze, and simply stayed to see what Sunday would bring. Peter stayed. And Sunday brought something that changed everything. I left before seeing it. Is there something you destroyed trying to force a result that did not arrive in the time you had set? A relationship, a faith, a trust, a chance. Did you make a decision that seemed necessary, inevitable, even courageous at the time, and later revealed itself to have been built on an expectation you had never checked against reality? And if so, did you leave before Sunday? You can still stay. You can still knock and wait for the answer before declaring that the door is closed. You can still discover whether the mercy you saw offered to everyone else was also available to you, instead of deciding alone without trying that it was not. That was the only thing I did differently from Peter, and it was enough to change everything. If you have ever loved something with everything you had and still destroyed it, tell me in the comments. You will understand what I said.